Howdy, friends. I'm Joel Empey, and welcome to another episode of Joel Empey Talks NFL. And on today's episode, we're going to look at Week 13 quarterbacks and defenses to stream for your fantasy football team. We're also going to look at Thanksgiving. We're going to give a preview for Thursday's Thanksgiving matchups. I'm going to give you one bet for each of the three games that I really like this week. We're also going to look at must-watch games in Week 13. We're going to start today's episode by talking about the AFC South playoff race. So the reason why we're going to focus on the AFC South playoff race is because it's the only division in the NFL that has three teams that are legitimately contending to win the division. The three teams, of course, are the Houston Texans, who are in the lead right now. They're 7-4 on the season. And then you have the Tennessee Titans and the Indianapolis Colts, both sitting at 6-5, so just one game behind the Houston Texans. And it's worth noting the Titans and the Texans play each other two times still, remaining in this year. They play each other in Week 15 and Week 17. So those two games are going to be very, very important. So let's break down where the Texans are sitting at right now a little bit deeper than just their record of 7-4. So on the season, their points for 265, points against 249, a plus 16 margin. Their remaining schedule, they have versus New England this upcoming week, which I think is a loss. I think it's pretty safe to say. New England hasn't been as good recently, but they still win, even though they're not dominating like they were earlier this year. Then they're versus Denver. That should be a win for the Texans. At Tennessee, that's going to be tough. Tennessee's playing really good recently. So at Tennessee, that's going to be a tough one to win. At Tampa Bay, I really like the Texans to win that one. And then versus Tennessee. So I think the best case scenario, best projection for the Texans for their remaining schedule is a 4-1 projection. One loss to the Patriots and call them beating the Broncos, beating the Buccaneers, and beating the Titans twice. That's the best projection that's reasonable in my opinion. Sure, they could go 5-0 technically, but that's the most reasonable best projection. Now, the most reasonable worst projection, I should say, would be 2-3 in my opinion. I think the worst, realistically, that the Texans are going to do for the remainder of the season is 2-3. Losing to the Patriots, perhaps losing both games to the Titans or one game to the Titans and, flubbing one of the other games against either the Bucs or the Broncos. But, I still think that no matter what, they'll win at least two games, right? Even if they do that, they go 2-3 for the rest of the season. They would finish at 9-7. That might be good enough to make them in the playoffs. I think the likeliest outcome for the Texans is a 3-2 finish for the remainder of the season, finishing them at a 10-6 record. I think they're going to lose one of the Patriots and probably one of the two to the Titans, and they'll win the other three. So 10-6 is what I'm projecting for the Texans. Now let's look at the Colts. Points for 244, points against 226. That's a margin of plus 18, so a little bit better than the Texans' point margin on the season. Remaining schedule versus Tennessee. That's going to be a really tough game. That is basically a do or die game coming up this week for the Colts. At Tampa Bay, that should be a win for them. Tampa Bay is a tough team though. They can play anybody tough, They can put up a lot of points. They can play spoiler really easily. At New Orleans, that's a loss in my opinion. Versus Carolina, that's going to be a really tough one as well. And then at Jacksonville, probably a win for them. So the best projection that I could see the Colts having at this point would be 4-1. Beating the Titans, beating the Bucs, losing to the Saints, and then beating the Panthers and the Jaguars. I think that's a harder schedule than the Texans have, though, to be honest. The Texans really just have the Patriots and then the Titans to worry about. So the worst projection I could imagine for the Colts is 1-4. I could see them just winning one of those two games between the Bucs and the Jaguars and then losing the other four. That's actually a pretty realistic possibility in my mind with how many injuries the Colts have. My expectation for the Colts is that they'll go 2-3. I do think they'll lose to the Titans. I do think they'll lose to the Saints. And I do think they'll lose to Carolina. I believe that they'll be able to beat the Jaguars and beat the Bucs, but 2-3 at this point would finish them on the year. Their finishing record would be 8-8, which wouldn't be good enough for the playoffs by any stretch. Now the Titans, they're 6-5. they actually have the best point differential out of these three teams on the season. They actually have the 10th fewest points given up out of the entire NFL this year. They have 245 points for, 217 points against, margin of plus 28, so 10 better than the Colts, who are 2 better than the Texans. Their remaining schedule, the Tennessee Titans, they are at Indianapolis, they are at Oakland, they are versus Houston, versus New Orleans, and at Houston. Those last 3 games, those are nightmare games. I don't think that the Titans, I'm definitely not going to favor them against the Saints. I think that they could steal one of those 2 games against Houston. You know, the game against Indy, that's a do or die game for both teams. I think that they've got to win that one, and I think with the injuries to the Colts, I think they will win that one. At Oakland, that's going to be another tough one. Oakland's fighting for a playoff spot themselves. They did just get embarrassed this past weekend, but they've had some good showings this year. So that's going to be a tough one. The best projection I could imagine for the Titans would be 4-1. You know, it's possible that they have the Texans number. They haven't played yet this year, so who knows? It's possible they could have the Texans number and they could sweep them to, in both those games, and they could very conceivably beat the Colts and the Raiders, and lose to the Saints to have a best reasonable projection, in my opinion, of 4-1. Their worst possible projection, though, out of these 3 teams is definitely the worst, though. Like, they could go 0-5. They could just, crap the bed for the rest of the year. Even though they've been very good since Tannehill took over the team, they could crap the bed for the rest of the year. They don't have any gimmies. There's no gimmies left for the Titans. At Indianapolis, at Oakland, both those teams are fighting for playoff spots. Versus Houston. Houston's the divisional leader right now. Versus New Orleans, obviously a Super Bowl contender, and then at Houston. They could go 0-5. That's really possible. I expect that they'll go 3-2. I expect that they'll beat the Colts. I expect that they'll beat the Raiders. It's a tough one as well, and I expect that they'll take one of the 2 games from the Texans. So I'm expecting them to finish 9-7. So once again, I'm expecting a 10-6 finish from the Texans. I'm expecting an 8-8 finish from the Colts, and I'm expecting a 9-7 finish from the Titans. So if I'm expecting those records for those teams, then obviously I'm expecting the Texans are the likeliest team to win the division. But I think that, and this might be where people disagree with me, I think the Titans have a better chance of finishing higher in the division than the Colts do at this point. The Colts are just, have been decimated with injuries all year. It's not their fault. Obviously, Luck is out before the year begins. Brissett's been playing amazing, though. But then, T.Y. Hilton's been out a bunch, and Marlon Mack breaks his hand, and he's out for the foreseeable future. Darius Leonard, the key player, key centerpiece of their defense, had to miss multiple games this year. So it's not on the Colts particularly, but just look at how well Ryan Tannehill has done for the Titans. If you don't think the Titans are a good football team, look at what Tannehill's done and what the Titans have done since Tannehill took over. When Tannehill originally took over, the Titans were 2-5. Ever since Tannehill started, the Titans have gone 4-1 over this last 5-game stretch. Wins over the Chargers, wins over the Bucks, wins over the Chiefs, and an absolute beatdown over the Jaguars. So with Tannehill playing that well, the Titans winning as much as they are, Derrick Henry's a battering ram of a guy who seems to get better and better as the season goes on and as he gets more and more carries. The Titans' defense, like I said, they've allowed the 10th least amount of points of any defense in the NFL throughout this season. It's possible that the Titans could steal this division from the Texans because they have 2 games remaining against the Texans. If they sweep that series, the Titans are going to win this division, in my opinion. Now, even if they don't win the division at 9-7 in the AFC, that might be enough to get that 6th wildcard spot. I think Buffalo has a pretty commanding hold on that, that first wildcard spot, that 5th overall seed in the AFC. But that 6th overall seed is up for grabs. The Steelers are trying to grab for it, who, they're playing Duck Hodges at quarterback. They're pulling Mason Rudolph in the middle of the game. Sure, their defense is absolutely undeniably elite, but I don't know if I have faith in the Steelers. I would favor the Titans over the Steelers at this point if they were to play one another. And then you've got the Raiders, who just got absolutely dominated by the Jets. When you really look at it, the Titans have a legit chance at making the 6th seed, and they have a legit chance with 2 games remaining against the Texans to win the AFC South outright. Now, looking at must-watch games for Week 13, the first game that I'm going to talk about is Thanksgiving Day game, the Bills at the Dallas Cowboys. This is an interesting game. We have an AFC-NFC crossover game here, and it's a game where the Bills, the 5th seed in the AFC, who, could be winning if they were in a weaker division, could be the divisional leader if they were in a weaker division, are going to be taking on the Cowboys, who are the division leader in the weakest division in the NFC. So it's going to be interesting to see if the best wildcard team in the AFC is better than the worst divisional leader in the NFC. So we're going to get some interesting crossplay in this game here. Both teams have really middling run defenses and very high-level run offenses. So that should somewhat wash one another out. And now the real matchup in this game that's going to determine the outcome, in my opinion, is the Dallas passing game versus the Bills pass defense. Now, the Dallas passing game in terms of yards per game is number 1 in the NFL, and the Bills pass D in terms of yards per game is the number 3 D in the NFL. So very elite matchup going on there between those two. I think if the Bills can contain Amari Cooper and Michael Gallup, that's going to be the key to them winning this game. They can, to a degree, let Ezekiel Elliott beat them. They cannot allow the receiving core to beat them. If the Bills want to win this game, and I think that they can, I like the Bills as 7-point dogs this week. A little preview for the betting portion that's coming up. I think the Bills have a decent chance at winning this one. It's going to be a hell of a game. It's the game I'm looking most forward to on Thanksgiving Day. Now, the next game I'm going to talk about might be the most excited I've been for any NFL game all year. And that's not hyperbole. The San Francisco 49ers are at the Baltimore Ravens in what is a rematch from the 2012 epic Super Bowl. And the interesting thing about this game, as it being a Super Bowl rematch, is that the teams have almost adopted one another's identities in a way, at least offensively. Think about Lamar Jackson and the dual threat running style offense that the Ravens are employing right now. It's just like what the Niners were doing with Colin Kaepernick back in the day. In fact, it's the same offensive coordinator in Baltimore that was in San Francisco coaching Colin Kaepernick back in the day. And then you look at the opposite side, at the Niners side of the ball, they have a very meat and potatoes, run-dominant game, try to mitigate mistakes from their quarterback, try to lean on the defense to win them games. It's just like what the Ravens were like back in 2012. So it's a really interesting flip-flop of identities. But this is a crazy thing. Both those teams went to the Super Bowl that year. I think both of these teams are better on paper, like in terms of comparing them to their the contemporaries, like the other teams that they're going up against. The Ravens weren't the best team in the AFC. Joe Flacco went on a historic run in the playoffs that brought them to the Super Bowl. And sure, the Niners were one of the best teams in the NFC. That is for sure. Back then, they had the great defense and, Colin Kaepernick dynamic offense over there in San Francisco. But I think the Niners are probably the number 1 team in the NFC right now. The Ravens are definitely... the Niners are definitely the number 1 team in the NFC right now after the beatdown they put on the Packers last night. And then the Ravens are definitely the number 1 team in the AFC right now. So it's a Super Bowl rematch, and somehow the teams are even better this year than they were in their Super Bowl run seasons. It's going to be really, really interesting to see that, Joey Bosa and that Niners defensive line rushing after Lamar Jackson. That's going to be the matchup of the game. Who can Lamar get loose, or can that defensive line contain him? That is going to be the determining factor for who wins and who loses that game. Now, the last must-watch game for Week 13 is mercifully a Monday Night Football game, so we get prime time. Everybody's going to get to see it. It's the Vikings at the Seahawks, and this is just a great game. Besides the fact that it's just dripping with playoff implications, it's just a great game of, old school football, grounded pound. We're gonna play the defense. We're gonna run the ball 30 times a game. Both teams are committed to that style of play, and it's gonna be interesting to see who's better at that style. When two people or two teams have similar styles and they go head to head, that's always really fun to see who can implement that style more effectively. Now the Vikings, this is going to be a really, really clutch game for them if they can get the victory here, because not only would it be a road victory in Seattle, which is extremely difficult to come by, especially in prime time, but it would allow the Vikings to, at the very least, keep pace with the Packers, who are also 8-3. And if you beat the Seahawks in Seattle, and that at least keeps pace, if the Packers happen to lose next week, it would actually, the Vikings would be ahead of the Packers. So if they could beat the Seahawks, that would just be tremendous for the Vikings' confidence going down the stretch here. Beating a legitimate team, a 9-2 team in Seattle that is one of the best in the NFL. Russell Wilson playing MVP type of football. If they could get that victory, everybody says it's like Kirk Cousins' biggest downfall is his confidence, his ability to play well in key games, in key situations, prime time. If Kirk Cousins can win this prime time matchup, it's off to the races for the Minnesota Vikings. And it would also be huge for all those Niner fans out there, because that would drop the Seahawks to 2 games behind the Niners, and the Niners obviously have to play the Ravens next week. So that's going to be a really tough one to win for the Niners. I'm not saying they can't win it, but that's going to be a tough one for them to win. So if the Seahawks would also happen to lose next week, that would keep the breathing room there for the Niners, who, if they were to lose next week, the Niners, and the Seahawks were to win next week, they would have a tied record, and that would not be obviously very good for Niners and Niners fans going forward. So this game is just dripping with playoff implications once again. I can't wait for it. Those are my top 3 must-watch games for Week 13. All right, now let's do a Thanksgiving Day betting preview. I'm going to give you one bet for each of the games that I really, really like this week. Now, the first game that I like is the Bears -1.5 at Detroit. I was right about the Bears not being able to cover the spread last week, as they were like 6.5 or 5.5, something like that, point favorites over the Giants, and the Giants did manage to beat the spread. This week, I like the Bears. It's only 1.5 points, and they're playing the Lions, who have Jeff Driscoll at quarterback, who has not been very good lately. Think about Jeff Driscoll going up against this just dangerous Bears defense. He's going to give turnovers. They're going to have short fields to work with. 1.5 points. That's basically a pick 'em. I understand the Bears are on the road here, but this is a gimme in my opinion. I think the Bears easily, win this game. I think they easily win this game, so they should easily cover 1.5 points. It's such a small spread. I don't think that the Bears are going to win by 10 points or anything crazy. I think it will be, probably a 7-point game, because the Bears, aren't the best offense, and the Lions, don't have the worst defense. But at the end of the day, the Bears easily cover 1.5 points. If you look at Trubisky, and I'm going to go more into this when I get to my QB streamers, it's a bit of a spoiler here. Trubisky, in his last 2 matchups against this Matt Patricia ran Detroit Lions defense, listen to this. He put up, most recently this year, a 131 passer rating, 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. And you look back at last year, Mitch Trubisky put up a 148.6 passer rating, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, and a rushing touchdown in a game against Detroit in this Matt Patricia-led Lions defense. Trubisky isn't a guy that you can usually trust. I think you can trust him in this matchup. I love the Bears -1.5 at the Lions. Now, the Bills +7 at Dallas is a bet that I love, and the reason why I love that bet is I just generally love the Bills +7 against anybody. They're a team that's just gritty. They're grimy. They're gonna make it ugly, which is a recipe for having, a low differential in scoring in a game. I just think the Bills are a team they're not going to get blown out by anybody. I'll take them +7 versus anybody. And I think they have a play style that translates to the short week with their, quarterback runs and stuff like that. That's more, like the quarterback runs is something that you can just see in the moment and just take it and go, right? Whereas, on a short week, you won't. On a short week, you won't have the super well designed plays that are going to exploit the weaknesses of the defense, because you just don't have the time to pour over the game film, especially when it's an AFC team playing an NFC team. They have no familiarity with one another, so they're not going to have the time to really know the ins and outs. So this is going to be a game where Dak Prescott and Josh Allen, a couple of athletic quarterbacks, might be making some plays with their legs. It's going to be an ugly game, low-scoring game in my opinion. I love the Bills +7. Now, the final Thanksgiving Day bet that I like is the over bet on the Saints at Atlanta. And I would understand why you might have some apprehension betting the over in this game. The over is 49 points. It's the highest over on the week. But it's the highest over on the week, tied with the Vikings at the Seahawks and the Bucks at the Jaguars. Now, in my opinion, out of those three games, if you were just to ask me straight up, out of those three games, which do you think is going to be the highest scoring? I would easily say the Saints and the Falcons. So the fact that these three games are all projected to be 49 points, and I think that easily it's going to be the highest scoring out of the three of those games, makes me interested in the over on this game. Now, another reason I can understand your apprehension, because they obviously played each other 3 weeks ago, the Saints and the Falcons, that is, and the game was low scoring. The Falcons looked sensational on defense, out of nowhere, I might add. And the score was 26-9 in favor of the Falcons. And that was in New Orleans, where, New Orleans is usually just absolutely dominant and lights out at home. Drew Brees is, they usually put up 40 points when they play home games. But I feel optimistic that the Saints, they're a team. Sean Payton and the Saints, if you know football, you know that these guys are guys that, you can buy the revenge game narrative when it's Sean Payton. He's going to try to right the wrong. He feels embarrassed from that loss. He's going to go out there and try to put his foot on the throat of his opponent and suffocate them. That's Sean Payton's style, right? And if you look, the Falcons this past weekend, after the Falcons had a couple of good games in a row defensively, where, it was starting to look like, man, are the Falcons good now? Like, is this turning around? The Falcons lost the Bucks 35-22, and that was at home for Atlanta as well, where they're usually way better, which would be a reason to be nervous about this game not scoring high, is because Atlanta's usually so much better at home. They give up 35 to the Bucks and put up 22 themselves, which I might add crushes the over of 49 points this week, if you just look at the Falcons score from last week. Now, the Saints beat the Panthers 34-31, which once again also, shows that they're very capable of playing games and massively outscoring a 49-point total. The Saints giving up a lot of points to a really mediocre offense, and they can score a lot of points against a good defense. So they can let in a lot of points to a mediocre offense. That's what Atlanta is. They're a mediocre offense. They would be a good offense if they had a running game on an offensive line. But as it is right now, Matt Ryan, competent quarterback, Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones. Julio does have a bit of an injury right now, but Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Matt Ryan. It's a competent, mediocre offense, right? The Saints allowed a Panthers team, who's also a mediocre offense, to put up 31 points. So it's conceivable the Saints can give up a lot of points to a mediocre offense, right? And then the Saints against the Panthers, who are a very good defense. Not very, very good, but certainly much better than the Falcons have been throughout most of the season. They put up 34 points against that defense. So I feel like the Saints can definitely let in a lot of points. They can definitely put up a lot of points. The Falcons, the same thing is true for them. So I think this is going to be a very high-scoring affair. It's going to look a lot more similar to how these epic NFC South matchups between the Saints and the Falcons usually look. They're usually barn burners, very entertaining games. That last one that they played, 26-9 defensive game, was not indicative of how the series usually goes. I think the game this week will be indicative of how the series usually goes, and it's going to be a high-scoring game. All right, guys, now we're going to look at fantasy streamers just at the quarterback and defensive positions. Those are the key streaming positions besides tight end. But tight end is such a headache this year. I'm done talking about it. My number one quarterback streamer for the week 13, is a guy that, if you play in an astute league, is likely already taken because he's had some killer matchups recently and has been on fire and has some killer matchups next week and the week after, which is why if he is available, you have to go out and get him, and that's Sam Darnold. Look at his last 3 games he played against the Giants, the Redskins, and the Raiders. So because of that, and he put up great fantasy performances in all of those games, he's probably already owned in your league. In those 3 games, Darnold put up 21 points, 25 points, and 27 points. He's averaging over 24 points per game over the last 3 weeks. And his total of over 27 points this past weekend against the Raiders was good enough to make him the QB2 on the week behind Ryan Tannehill, of all people. The quarterbacks right now, streaming is proving to be a very intelligent and valuable way to get good production out of your quarterback right now. So check your waiver wire to see if Sam Darnold's available. If he is available, you have to get him. He's your top priority without a doubt. This upcoming week, he plays the Bengals, who are the 3rd worst in terms of giving fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. And then the week after that, he plays the Dolphins, who are the 4th worst, and he plays them at home. In terms of giving fantasy points away to opposing quarterbacks. So his next 2 matchups are even better than his previous 3 matchups where he was averaging over 24.3 fantasy points per game. So Sam Darnold is a slam dunk for the next 2 weeks. Then he's got terrible matchups for the rest of the year. So milk him right now while you still can, because after that, you're going to need somebody else. The next quarterback I'm going to talk about is Nick Foles, who hasn't been, he hasn't inspired confidence in you as a fantasy GM over his 2 games since he came back. But an interesting stat is that he threw 47 times and then 48 times in his 2 games that he's been back. If he even has, half, 3/4 of that volume against the horrendous Tampa Bay Buccaneers pass defense, he's going to have a very good fantasy football day. He still has DJ Chark, who's a hell of a fantasy threat. So against an atrocious Bucs D, Nick Foles is actually a very, very safe floor play. And you have to think also, the Bucs offense, very dynamic in their own right. And the Titans offense just put up a lot of points against this Jaguars team. So I think the Buccaneers are going to sling the ball and probably put up points to where the Jags aren't going to just lean on their run game. For one, the Bucs run defense is really good, so they can't just lean on their run game. But for 2, if the Bucs are scoring a lot, they're going to have to throw the ball, the Jags are, in order to try to keep pace and try to, win the game. They're going to play to win, right? If Nick Foles throws the ball 3/4, 75% of the amount that he's thrown over his 2 games since he's been back, let's call it 35, 36 pass attempts against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, that's going to provide an insanely safe floor and a high ceiling. So Nick Foles is a guy worth going out to get. He's a mediocre quarterback that I don't know if you're going to get another chance to play him this year. In fact, I would say you're definitely not going to get another chance to play him this year. So if you need a quarterback 1 week streamer for this week, this is your chance to use Nick Foles. Now, my final quarterback streaming option I'm going to talk about for this week is a guy playing on Thanksgiving Day. I already spoiled it a little bit earlier when I was talking about my Thanksgiving Day bets, and that's Mitch Trubisky. Trubisky's another guy that I understand apprehension about wanting to play this guy. I mean, he's been dog awful throughout this year generally, but he plays well against Matt Patricia's defenses. If you look at the 2 matchups that he's had against these Matt Patricia Detroit Lions defenses, I'll once again say his passer rating this year when he played them was 131. He threw for 3 touchdowns, had over 19 fantasy points, no interceptions. And then last year, you look at his 1 matchup against this Matt Patricia Detroit Lions defense, he had a passer rating of 148.6. 3 passing touchdowns, no interceptions, and a rushing touchdown to boot, over 34 fantasy points that week. Against this Matt Patricia defense, it looks like Trubisky has their number a little bit. If he, scores between 19 and 34 fantasy points like he did, to average out his last 2 performances against this team, that would be an insanely valuable day. And Detroit gives up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks this year. People seem to think that they're pretty good on defense, and they're all right defensively, Detroit is, from like an NFL football perspective, but from a fantasy football perspective, they're not good to opposing quarterbacks. They average over 20 points allowed per game. And we've got Jeff Driscoll on the Lions side, who's sure to turn the ball over a couple of times against this extremely dangerous Chicago Bears defense. He's going to turn the ball over a couple of times. He's going to give the Bears some short fields to work with, which is just going to increase the opportunities at scoring touchdowns for Mitchell Trubisky. I love Trubisky this week, and I don't say that very often. Now, looking at streaming options for fantasy football defenses this week, the number 1 streaming option is going to be the Eagles at Miami. That's an obvious one. Miami gives up the most fantasy points per game to defenses. And the Eagles have been really good the last couple of weeks since their secondary has gotten healthy. They played a damn good game against the Patriots, and then they played a good game against the Seahawks, who, both the passing touchdowns that the Eagles have given up, they've given up 1 passing touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks. Both of those passing touchdowns were on trick plays. So this Eagles secondary isn't the same secondary that it has been all year. That narrative is now dead. This secondary is healthy, they're good, and that matches the talent of their front 7. It doesn't match the talent, I shouldn't say that. The front 7 is still the strength of the defense, but the secondary now, can at least, aid that front 7 a little bit and make them even more effective. Anytime you can get a mediocre or better defense against the Miami Dolphins offense, you have to take that. The Dolphins, once again, are giving up the most fantasy points per game to defenses. So take the Eagles this week. That's my number 1 pick. My number 2 fantasy defense to stream this week is the Jets at Cincinnati. Now, this is a better high floor play, but a lower ceiling play than the Eagles or the next team that I'm going to talk about. And the reason why it's a lower ceiling is the Bengals just, they don't even play to win. They play to lose by as little as possible. Do you remember when they were losing by over 30 points to the Ravens a couple of weeks ago? They had 10 points on the board. They were down by over 30. And they went for a field goal to put 13 points on the board in the 4th quarter, just so the loss wouldn't be as embarrassing. They're losing by over 30 points, and Mixon still is getting 25 rushes a game. So the Bengals will just run the ball and then punt the ball, rather than actually try to win. So because of that, they're not going to put the ball in the air in as risky, and risk it turning the ball over as much, even if they're getting absolutely dominated in the game. So that lowers the chances for the Jets to get turnovers, lowers, the boom potential of a potential defensive touchdown. But having said all that, Cincinnati playing as conservative as they are, the Jets playing as good as they just did last weekend, where they embarrassed the Oakland Raiders, just embarrassed the Raiders. They're coming off a hot performance. The Bengals give up the 3rd most points to opposing defenses. The Bengals aren't going to score in this game. They're going to play it safe. They're going to have a low total. So that makes the Jets a high floor. But like I said, the upside, the boom potential isn't necessarily there. So if you need a defense that's going to be safe rather than a defense that you need a boom out of, I would go with the Jets this week. So I lied when I said the Eagles are my number 1 streaming defense this week. My number 1 streaming defense this week is the Panthers versus the Redskins. Without a doubt. The guy to attack in fantasy football in terms of defenses defenses that you want is whoever is playing the Redskins. We have to attack Dwayne Haskins. He's horrendous. He's the worst quarterback in the league right now. Worst starting quarterback in the league right now. The biggest liability for hemorrhaging fantasy points to opposing defenses. Now, on top of all of that, I'm going to take any defense as my number 1 streaming defense of the week if they're less than 50% owned, which is the one qualification for a team to be streamable, is they have to be less than 50% owned. And so any team that's less than 50% owned playing the Redskins, that's going to be my number one streaming option every single week. I don't care if it's the New York Giants playing the Redskins. I don't care if it's the Dolphins playing the Redskins. I will take the Dolphins D against the Redskins. That's how bad Dwayne Haskins is. And so we haven't even talked about how good the Panthers are. We've only talked about how bad the Redskins are. And already, you should be at least, pretty convinced that the Panthers are a good D. But just listen to this. The Panthers are second in the NFL in sacks this year. They have 41 sacks in 11 games, almost 4 sacks a game. And then they're third most in interceptions this year with 13 interceptions in 11 games. That's over 1 interception a game. If they're doing that on average, if they're averaging like 4 sacks a game and 1 interception a game, they're going to easily clear that average against the Redskins, who are going to try to actually play to win, even though they're pitiful and they have no chance at winning. They actually will try to play to win. They actually will put the ball in the air, which increases the Panthers' chance at booming with extra turnovers, defensive touchdowns, and so on. The Panthers are my number one streaming defense this week. You can guarantee to lock that up. All right, so that does it for this episode of Joel Empey Talks NFL, and I want to thank you for watching this video. If you did make it all the way to the end, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel, share it with any friends, get your mom to subscribe if she's got a YouTube account, comment below in the YouTube comments. I love responding to any comments, any questions you have around fantasy football, betting, anything, just comment below, and follow me on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at Empey Talks. I try to post more often over there. That's my preferred social media platform to try to grow. So that does it for this episode. Until next time, cheers, friends.